Hello, everyone, and welcome to Veil of Hearts, where love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it burns. You're still wearing my ring, Ava. The words came from behind her, low and poisonous, slicing through the laughter and music of the ballroom. Liam Vaughn's voice, calm, familiar, and cruel, made her freeze for just a second. Ava Steele turned around slowly. Her silver gown shimmered under the golden light, her eyes colder than the champagne in her hand. That ring, he continued, stepping closer, was supposed to remind you who you belong to. A quiet chuckle slipped from her lips. You're right, she whispered, meeting his gaze. It does. It reminds me of everything I survived. The crowd hushed. The man who once broke her heart stood speechless. And for the first time, she was the one holding power. You're still wearing my ring. Ava. The voice cut through the soft hum of violins and laughter, like a blade against glass. For a moment, the ballroom fell silent, not because the music stopped, but because Ava Steele did. She stood near the edge of the marble staircase, her hand wrapped around a glass of champagne that trembled ever so slightly. Her silver gown shimmered beneath the chandelier, catching every flicker of light as if it refused to let darkness touch her again. Slowly, she turned. Liam Vaughn stood behind her, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, confidence dripping from every word he spoke. His smirk was the same, arrogant, practiced, dangerous. The kind of smile that once made her heart race, and now made her skin crawl. Mr. Vaughn, she said, her tone steady, polite. The same tone one might use with a stranger. He tilted his head, amused. Oh, so formal now? I remember when you used to say my name like it meant something. Ava met his gaze. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had already lost everything once and learned how to rebuild. That was a long time ago, she said softly, before I realized some names aren't worth saying out loud. The words landed sharp, and for a second his jaw tightened. But Liam was never one to lose face, especially not in front of an audience. They were surrounded by New York's elite, CEOs, investors, designers, and socialites dressed in glitter and greed. The Croft Studio X Steel Group Gala, a night meant to celebrate a historic collaboration, had suddenly turned into something far more electric. People pretended not to stare, but their eyes lingered, drawn to the tension between the woman who'd been betrayed and the man who'd built an empire out of deceit. Beside Liam, a woman with striking red hair clung to his arm. Samantha Reed, Steel Group's glamorous PR director, his lover, and once upon a time Ava's friend. Samantha's smile was sugar-coated venom. Well, if it isn't Ava Steele, Samantha said sweetly. I hardly recognized you. You've changed so much since you disappeared. Ava's lips curved into a faint smile. Disappearing was the healthiest thing I ever did. Liam chuckled, shaking his head. Still dramatic, I see. Tell me, Ava, what brings you here tonight? Last I checked, you had no place in this world anymore. That tone, that condescension. It was the same one he used when he told her she was nothing without him, that he made her who she was. Back then, she'd believed him, but not tonight. I'm here for business, she said calmly, setting her champagne glass down. This is a Croft Studio event, after all. Liam raised a brow. Croft Studio? Don't tell me you're one of their designers now. Samantha laughed lightly. Oh, Liam, be nice. Not everyone can afford to dream so high. Before Ava could answer, a voice, smooth, composed, confident, came from behind her. She's not one of our designers. The crowd parted slightly as Julian Croft approached, tall, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. He stopped beside Ava, placing a hand on her back. Not possessively, but protectively. She's the designer, Julian continued. Ava Steele is Croft Studio's lead creative director. Every design you've seen tonight, every concept, every presentation, came from her. Gasps rippled through the room like sparks leaping from a fire. Conversations halted. Champagne glasses paused mid-air. Liam's smirk faltered. You're joking, Julian's lips barely curved. Do I look like a man who jokes about business? Samantha blinked, her confident smile slipping just enough to show panic. Liam, for the first time in years, looked uncertain. His eyes darted between Ava and Julian, between the past he'd destroyed and the future she'd built without him. Ava turned slightly toward Julian, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Croft." Julian's gaze met hers, steady, quiet, knowing. "You don't need to thank me. You earned it." That simple exchange carried more weight than any applause ever could. The whispers began. "She's the lead designer? I thought she vanished after the divorce." "He must be furious." Ava lifted her chin, her posture flawless, untouchable. "If you'll excuse me," she said, brushing past Liam, "I have a presentation to prepare." Liam grabbed her wrist, not harshly, but enough to make her pause. His voice dropped low, dangerous. "You think this changes anything?" Ava turned to him, eyes glacial. "It already has." For a long moment they stared at each other, the man who once held her captive in his shadow, and the woman who had finally stepped into her own light. Around them, the music swelled again, violins rising like a tide reclaiming its shore. Julian's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Vaughn, I believe the press is waiting for your statement. Wouldn't want them to see you rattled, would we?" The hint of mockery in his tone was subtle but sharp. Liam's hand fell away. Ava exhaled softly and walked toward the stage, her heels clicking against marble, each step a quiet declaration of power reclaimed. The crowd parted before her, drawn to the elegance of a woman who no longer needed permission to exist. At the top of the steps, she paused, feeling Liam's stare burning into her back. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to, because she knew, for the first time, he was the one watching her walk away. And as she stood beneath the spotlight, ready to unveil her work to the world, Ava Steele smiled. The same man who once took everything from her was now just another face in the audience, and this time, he was the one left trembling. As the applause echoed through the ballroom, Ava held her smile. Yet beneath the glitter and applause, a memory stirred. Quiet, unwelcome, and sharp as glass. The nightlights blurred into a swirl of gold and white, and suddenly she wasn't in New York's grand ballroom anymore. She was 22 again, and he was just a name on a list of new employees. 6 years earlier, Liam Vaughn was the kind of man who didn't wait for chances. He created them. He grew up in a forgotten neighborhood on the edge of Chicago, the kind of place where ambition was a luxury few could afford. But Liam? He wore ambition like armor. He graduated top of his class, determined to claw his way out of the life that tried to bury him. When he walked into Steel Group for the first time, he didn't just see a job, he saw a kingdom. And he intended to conquer it. He started in the marketing department, surrounded by polished suits and pedigreed employees who looked at him like an outsider. But within months, he outperformed them all. Long nights, perfect pitches, flawless presentations. He didn't smile much, didn't joke. Every move was calculated, every word deliberate. By the end of his first year, Liam's numbers were impossible to ignore. His strategies brought in major clients, his campaigns went viral, and soon, whispers spread through the company. The young strategist was a genius. The board promoted him to marketing director, one of the youngest in Steel Group's history. He told himself this was only the beginning. But fate had other plans that came dressed in soft laughter and summer perfume. When Ava Steele walked into the office for the first time, no one dared to treat her like just another intern. She was the daughter of Richard and Martha Steele, the founders of Steel Group, the kind of people whose last name carried weight in every corporate circle of Manhattan. But Ava didn't want special treatment. She wanted to earn her place. Her father insisted she start as a trainee, to understand the company from the ground up. So, she walked in that morning with her coffee, her notebook, and an optimism that filled the room before she even spoke. And Liam Vaughn hated her for it. At least, that's what he told himself. From his corner office, he watched her during meetings, bright-eyed, curious, too unguarded for this world. She asked too many questions, laughed too easily, and treated the interns like equals. To him, she was naive, a rich girl playing at hard work. Their first interaction was brief but unforgettable. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, standing by his office door. "I read your campaign proposal." "It's brilliant." He looked up from his laptop, unimpressed. "Flattery doesn't work here, Miss Steele." Her smile didn't falter. "Good thing I wasn't trying to flatter you. I just think it's rare to see a campaign that actually understands people." Liam blinked, caught off guard for half a second. No one ever spoke to him that casually, especially not the boss's daughter. From that day, she became a quiet disruption in his carefully controlled world. Weeks passed. Ava's ideas were unconventional, sometimes naive, but always fresh. She saw things differently, and though Liam wouldn't admit it, her creativity challenged his precision. Their work arguments became the highlight of every brainstorming session. He was logic. She was instinct. He built walls. She tore them down with a smile. One late evening, the office was nearly empty. Ava was still at her desk, surrounded by sketches and notes. Liam passed by, intending to leave, but paused when he saw her. "You know," he said, leaning against her desk. "Interns usually go home before midnight." She looked up, her eyes bright under the dim office light. "And directors usually mind their own business," he smirked. "Touché," she laughed softly. "I'm just trying to prove I belong here." He studied her for a moment. "You think staying late proves that?" "No," she said. "But quitting early never did anyone any good either." It was the first time he saw something in her beyond privilege, a spark of hunger, the same kind that drove him. And for reasons he didn't understand, it unsettled him. Over the next few months, that spark turned into something neither could ignore. Every project pulled them closer. Arguments over color schemes, heated debates about branding strategies, late nights spent fixing presentations until sunrise. Somewhere between those hours, irritation turned to fascination. He began to notice the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, the way her laughter softened the tension in any room, and when their hands brushed over the same folder one night, neither pulled away immediately. Ava looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be." He hesitated, just a second too long. "And you're not as innocent as you want people to believe." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. It wasn't a love story that began with fireworks. It started with friction. A push and pull neither of them could resist. For Ava, Liam was the first man who didn't treat her like glass. He challenged her, pushed her, made her feel seen beyond her last name. For Liam, Ava was the first person who looked at him and didn't see a project or a rival. She saw the man beneath the armor. One rainy night, after another long day, they ended up sharing an umbrella outside the office. The rain fell in silver streaks against the city lights, and as they waited for the car to arrive, Ava turned to him. "You know," she said, "for someone who claims to hate people, you spend a lot of time saving them." He raised a brow. "Saving them? You stayed back to help me finish the client proposal. You didn't have to." He looked at her for a long moment, rain sliding down his jawline. "Maybe I was saving myself the trouble of fixing your mistakes later," she smiled. "Maybe." The driver pulled up, and as she stepped toward the car, she glanced back at him. "Good night, Mr. Vaughn." He didn't reply. He only watched as she disappeared into the rain, realizing that somewhere between ambition and control, he'd already begun to lose both. By the end of that summer, the office gossip had shifted. The stoic director and the bright intern were inseparable, partners on every project, their synergy undeniable. And when their first campaign together won a national award, it wasn't just a professional victory. It was the night Liam finally let the walls crumble. After the celebration dinner, he found her on the terrace, gazing out at the city lights. "You did it," he said quietly. She smiled. "We did it." For a moment, the world felt suspended, the air thick with something unspoken. When he leaned in, she didn't pull away. Their first kiss wasn't soft. It was inevitable, a collision of ambition, pride, and something dangerously close to love. In the ballroom of the present, Ava's mind returned to that moment, that rooftop kiss that began everything and ended everything. And as she stood now, years later, watching Liam Vaughn shrink beneath the weight of his own downfall, she realized something she hadn't back then. He didn't just fall in love with her. He fell in love with her power. And when he couldn't control it, he tried to destroy it. But what he didn't know was that she had already learned how to rebuild from ashes. The rain had stopped hours ago, but in Ava's mind, it never truly did. Even now, years later, she could still remember that night outside the office. The first kiss, the taste of rain, the warmth that felt like forever. At the time, forever seemed possible. Back then, Liam Vaughn wasn't the cold, calculating man who ruled boardrooms with silence and fear. He was still the boy from Chicago who'd fought his way out of nothing. Ambitious, brilliant, and hers. Or so she thought. The first time Ava brought Liam home, her parents greeted him with the kind of politeness that only old money could perfect. Her father, Richard Steele, was composed and shrewd, a man who'd built Steele Group from the ground up. Her mother, Martha, was warm but sharp-eyed, watching Liam as if she could see through him. Dinner was quiet. The kind of quiet that tested a man's confidence. Liam passed every question like an interview he'd been preparing for his entire life. "I've read about your work in the marketing division," Richard said, slicing into his steak. "Your numbers are impressive." "Thank you, sir," Liam replied. "But numbers are just the beginning. What matters is the story they tell, and how people believe it." Richard's brows lifted slightly, not from offense, but intrigue. Few young men had the nerve to challenge him at his own table. When dinner ended, Martha caught Ava in the hallway. "He's charming," she said quietly. "Too charming," Ava smiled, brushing off the warning. "He's just confident." Her mother's eyes softened. "Confidence builds empires, darling, but it also burns them down." Ava laughed, young, in love, and so sure that love was enough to rewrite any truth. Liam didn't know until that night that Ava was the heiress of Steele Group, one of the most influential conglomerates in the country. And once he did, something shifted. A flicker of realization in his eyes that Ava mistook for awe. He told her later that he admired her humility, her drive, her refusal to rely on her last name. But what he admired more was the door she unknowingly opened for him, a door to everything he'd ever wanted. A year later, they married in a ceremony straight out of a magazine. The wedding was grand, elegant, televised. Celebrities attended, journalists swarmed, and the New York Times called it the union of innovation and legacy. Liam smiled for every camera, kissed her hand like a gentleman, and whispered promises beneath the veil. Promises Ava believed with every beat of her heart. "I'll make you proud," he told her that night. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I'll become beside you." And for a while, he did. Liam rose fast within Steele Group. Richard, impressed by his performance, promoted him to vice president of operations, and within 2 years, to CEO, the youngest in the company's history. Ava was proud. She saw his long nights, his sleepless ambition, and thought it was love, that he wanted to succeed for them. She never saw how his reflection changed each time he passed the company's glass walls, how his smile grew sharper, colder. He started replacing her father's trusted executives with his own people. Fresh minds, he called them. The rain had stopped hours ago, but in Ava's mind, it never truly did. Even now, years later, she could still remember that night outside the office. The first kiss, the taste of rain, the warmth that felt like forever. At the time, forever seemed possible. Back then, Liam Vaughn wasn't the cold, calculating man who ruled boardrooms with silence and fear. He was still the boy from Chicago who'd fought his way out of nothing. Ambitious, brilliant, and hers. Or so she thought. The first time Ava brought Liam home, her parents greeted him with the kind of politeness that only old money could perfect. Her father, Richard Steele was composed and shrewd, a man who'd built Steele Group from the ground up. Her mother, Martha, was warm but sharp-eyed, watching Liam as if she could see through him. Dinner was quiet. The kind of quiet that tested a man's confidence. Liam passed every question like an interview he'd been preparing for his entire life. "I've read about your work in the marketing division," Richard said, slicing into his steak. "Your numbers are impressive." "Thank you, sir," Liam replied. "But numbers are just the beginning. What matters is the story they tell and how people believe it." Richard's brows lifted slightly, not from offense, but intrigue. Few young men had the nerve to challenge him at his own table. When dinner ended, Martha caught Ava in the hallway. "He's charming," she said quietly. "Too charming," Ava smiled, brushing off the warning. "He's just confident." Her mother's eyes softened. "Confidence builds empires, darling, but it also burns them down." Ava laughed, young, in love, and so sure that love was enough to rewrite any truth. Liam didn't know until that night that Ava was the heiress of Steele Group, one of the most influential conglomerates in the country. And once he did, something shifted. A flicker of realization in his eyes that Ava mistook for awe. He told her later that he admired her humility, her drive, her refusal to rely on her last name. But what he admired more was the door she unknowingly opened for him, a door to everything he'd ever wanted. A year later, they married in a ceremony straight out of a magazine. The wedding was grand, elegant, televised. Celebrities attended, journalists swarmed, and the New York Times called it the union of innovation and legacy. Liam smiled for every camera, kissed her hand like a gentleman, and whispered promises beneath the veil. Promises Ava believed with every beat of her heart. "I'll make you proud," he told her that night. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I'll become beside you." And for a while, he did. Liam rose fast within Steele Group. Richard, impressed by his performance, promoted him to vice president of operations, and within 2 years, to CEO, the youngest in the company's history. Ava was proud. She saw his long nights, his sleepless ambition, and thought it was love, that he wanted to succeed for them. She never saw how his reflection changed each time he passed the company's glass walls, how his smile grew sharper, colder. He started replacing her father's trusted executives with his own people. Fresh minds, he called them. He shifted budgets, signed off on mergers without consulting anyone, and when Richard objected, Liam was ready. "Times are changing," Liam said during one of their board meetings. "Steele Group can't survive on legacy alone." Richard frowned. "And it can't survive on arrogance either." For a second, the room froze. Liam smiled, polite, practiced. "I'll take that as wisdom, sir." He didn't. Within 6 months, Richard stepped down for health reasons. The statement was Liam's doing. The old man's empire, built with decades of integrity, now belonged to his son-in-law. At home, things changed too. Their penthouse overlooked the city. All glass, all light, but inside it was always cold. Liam worked later, traveled more. He said it was for business, but Ava noticed the shift. The way he stopped asking her opinion, the way he corrected her in public, the way he seemed to forget that she once had dreams of her own. When she tried to talk to him, he brushed her off. "Not now, Ava. You wouldn't understand. Once," she asked. "Understand what, exactly?" He looked up from his laptop, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What it means to carry this company on my back." She folded her arms. "It was my father's company, Liam." He leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. "Was." The word hung between them like smoke, invisible, but choking. Ava told herself he was just under pressure, that the late nights and short tempers were part of success. She remembered what her mother had said. Confidence builds empires, but it also burns them down, and wondered for the first time which one she was living through. When Liam made the cover of Forbes, she threw him a quiet dinner to celebrate. He showed up late, barely kissed her cheek, and spent most of the evening on his phone. At one point, she asked, "Are you happy, Liam?" He didn't even look up. Happiness is a luxury, Ava. Success isn't. The words stung, not because of what he said, but because she realized he meant them. The next morning, Ava found herself standing in their living room, staring at the panoramic view of the skyline. Everything below them looked small. The people, the buildings, even her own reflection in the glass. She tried to remember the last time he'd smiled at her without calculation. She couldn't. Their love, once built on long nights and laughter, now existed only in photographs. And even those were starting to feel staged. Still, she stayed. She believed against reason that the man she fell in love with was still in there somewhere, buried beneath ambition and ego. But love can't compete with greed. Liam's hunger grew. Power wasn't enough anymore. He wanted control. He began moving Steel Group's investments, merging side companies, manipulating the board until every major decision went through him. Ava overheard whispers from employees, uneasy glances in meetings. She tried to ask him about them, but he dismissed her with a laugh. "You worry too much," he said. "I know what I'm doing." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love could soften ambition, that marriage could balance madness. But one night changed everything. It was late. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, waiting for him to come home. The sound of his phone buzzing woke her, messages lighting up the screen. The name that appeared again and again wasn't hers, Samantha Reed. She opened the message before her heart could stop her. "You looked incredible tonight. I still can't believe we pulled it off. Next time, maybe we celebrate somewhere quieter." Ava's chest tightened. Her hand trembled as she put the phone down. When Liam walked in hours later, his tie loose, his eyes tired, she was still sitting there, silent. He looked at her, then at the phone on the table. And for the first time, his mask slipped. "Don't," he said softly. "You don't understand," she stood. "Then explain it to me." But he didn't. He just sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You wouldn't get it. It's complicated." "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's simple. You lied." He stared at her for a long time, then turned away. In the weeks that followed, Liam buried himself in work. He claimed the company needed him more than ever. Ava tried to reach him, to reason with him, but each attempt only pushed him further away. He stopped coming home. He stopped pretending. And slowly, Ava realized, the man she once defended, the man she thought she loved, wasn't ambitious anymore. He was consumed. By the time she saw her father again, Richard was older, quieter, but not surprised. "I warned you," he said gently. "A man like him doesn't love people. He loves power." Ava wanted to argue, but she couldn't. The truth was already written in the cold distance of Liam's eyes. Still, she looked out over the city that night and whispered to herself, maybe love can still fix this. But deep down, she already knew. Love couldn't fix what was never broken. It could only delay the fall. And Liam Vaughn was about to fall harder than he'd ever dreamed of rising. The nights were getting longer. Ava used to love the sound of the rain tapping on their glass windows. Now it only reminded her of how empty their home had become. Liam barely came home anymore. When he did, his cologne lingered longer than his presence. He had stopped pretending, and she had stopped asking. Somewhere between the silence and the distance, love had turned into a transaction. Cold, wordless, and cruelly efficient. The whispers began at the office. Ava heard them first from the assistants, the ones who always spoke too loudly near the elevators. "Mr. Vaughn's been spending a lot of time with Samantha Reed lately," one said. "Late meetings, private dinners. You think they're—" The other woman hushed her quickly, but not before Ava caught the name. Samantha Reed. She'd met Samantha before, the company's new PR director, elegant, ambitious, with a smile that could melt ice and a gaze that could cut through steel. Ava didn't want to believe it. Not at first. She told herself it was just gossip, noise made by people who envied their success. But deep down, her gut whispered a truth she wasn't ready to face. One night, she waited for him. Again. The clock hit midnight, then 1. When he finally walked in, his tie was undone, his phone buzzing in his hand. "Working late?" she asked softly. He glanced at her, surprised she was still awake. "You should sleep." "I would," she said, "if I knew where my husband actually worked these days." His expression froze. For a second she saw something flicker. Guilt, maybe. Then it was gone, replaced by irritation. "Don't start, Ava." "Then tell me I'm wrong," she pressed. "Tell me there isn't another woman." He didn't answer. Silence. Sharp and final. That silence told her everything she needed to know. Over the next few weeks, Ava stopped sleeping. Her intuition turned into suspicion, and suspicion into proof. She began digging, at first quietly, through the company reports, emails, bank statements. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for truth. And what she found was worse than betrayal. Hidden beneath layers of false contracts and offshore accounts was a shell corporation, Vaughn and Reed Consulting. Registered under Samantha's name, it was siphoning millions from Steel Group's marketing budget through fake vendor deals. Every invoice, every payment, signed off by her husband. Her hands trembled as she printed the documents. She stared at the evidence, the cold numbers that spelled out his greed. The empire her family built was being gutted from the inside, by the man she once trusted more than herself. When she confronted him, he didn't even flinch. She waited for him in his office, the folder on the desk. He walked in, loosened his cufflinks, and smiled. That same practiced, polite smile that had fooled everyone. "I found your little side business," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at the folder, then at her, and laughed softly. "You went through my accounts?" "Our accounts," she corrected. "You've been moving company funds, Liam, using Samantha to cover it up. Do you have any idea what this means?" He leaned against the desk, calm as ever. "It means I'm the reason this company's still growing. Those funds? Investments. You wouldn't understand." Her chest tightened. "You're stealing." "No," he said coldly. "I'm surviving. I'm building something bigger than what your father ever allowed me to be." Ava's voice shook. "You're destroying everything he built." His tone dropped, venomous. "Your father built nothing without me. I made Steel Group relevant again. And you—" He pointed at her, each word sharper than the last. "You're just the chairman's daughter. A pretty face with a famous name." The words hit like knives. She stepped back, tears burning her eyes. "How long have you been planning this?" He smirked. "Since the day your father underestimated me." Ava left that office trembling, not from fear, but from clarity. The man she'd loved was gone. In his place stood someone who would trade love for power without hesitation. That night, she went to her parents. Richard listened silently as she laid out the evidence, the fraud, the shell companies, the betrayal. Her mother cried quietly. Her father didn't. "He's smart," Richard said after a long pause. "Too smart. He'll make it look like we approved every move." Ava shook her head. "Then we fight him. We expose him," but Richard sighed. "He's already tightened his hold on the board. If we move too fast, we lose everything." And they did. Weeks later, Richard was forced to retire under board pressure. A decision orchestrated entirely by Liam. He replaced nearly every executive with people loyal to him. One by one, the old guard disappeared. Even the house, the one Ava grew up in, was no longer theirs. Liam had transferred ownership months before, hidden under the pretense of asset restructuring. When she confronted him again, he didn't even hide it. "This is business, Ava," he said. "You wouldn't last a day in this world if you keep leading with your heart." Her voice broke. "You took everything from my family." He stepped closer, his eyes cold. "Correction. I earned everything your family never thought I deserved." Ava slapped him. Hard. For a second, silence swallowed the room. His cheek reddened, Not from pain, but from wounded pride. Then he smiled. "You'll regret that. The divorce was brutal." Liam made sure of it. His lawyers tore apart every clause, every asset, every memory they shared. By the time it was over, he walked away with the company, the properties, and almost every cent. Ava got a settlement that barely covered her parents' debts. Reporters called it the fall of the steel empire. And through it all, Liam looked untouched, standing beside Samantha Reed, their hands intertwined at every public event. To the world, he was the golden CEO who saved Steel Group. To Ava, he was the man who'd set fire to everything she loved, and smiled while it burned. When the court finalized the divorce, Ava didn't cry. She walked out of the courthouse into the cold New York air, head high, eyes dry. Her parents waited outside. Her father's hair had turned grayer in the months of scandal, but his voice was steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have seen it sooner." Richard shook his head. "You loved him. That's not a crime." Her mother reached for her hand. "We lost the company, the house, but we didn't lose you. That's what matters." Those words cracked something open inside her, a mix of pain and relief. For years she'd been living in someone else's empire. Now all she had left was herself, and maybe that was enough. The next morning, they packed what little remained, boxes of clothes, old family photos, her sketchbooks from college. Her parents decided to move upstate, far from the city and its ghosts. Ava stayed behind, standing alone in the now empty penthouse. The city stretched out below her, glittering, indifferent. She walked to the window and pressed her palm against the glass. This was the same skyline she once looked at with hope. Now, it looked back at her with quiet pity. She whispered, "You can't take my soul, Liam. You already took everything else." In the weeks that followed, Ava disappeared from the tabloids. While Liam and Samantha paraded their new partnership, Ava rented a small apartment downtown. 1 bedroom, cracked walls, secondhand furniture. She started waking early again, making coffee the way she used to before the chaos. And for the first time in years, she opened her sketchbook. Lines turned into shapes. Shapes into patterns. Patterns into designs that bled emotion. Grief, rage, freedom. Her fingers trembled at first. But as the days went on, the movements became steady, deliberate. Design had always been her first love, buried under duty, marriage, and expectation. Now it was all she had left. One evening, she sat on the floor of her small studio, surrounded by sketches. The setting sun cast golden streaks across the paper, and for a fleeting moment she smiled. She wasn't rich anymore. She wasn't Mrs. Vaughn, but she was free. Her phone buzzed, an email from an unknown address. Croft's studio. The message was short. "We've seen your independent designs. Brilliant work. Are you available to discuss a potential collaboration?" She stared at the screen for a long time, disbelief turning into a trembling laugh. After everything, the betrayal, the loss, the humiliation, life had just cracked open a small window of light. Far away, in his penthouse office, Liam Vaughn stood before the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. Samantha leaned against the desk behind him, her smile sharp as glass. "You really think she's gone for good?" she asked. Liam smirked at his reflection. "Ava Steele was built to follow. She doesn't know how to fight." Samantha laughed softly. "Then let's make sure she never learns." But what neither of them knew was that Ava had already begun to fight. Quietly, relentlessly, with every sketch she drew. Because while Liam had taken her past, she was building something far more dangerous, her future. Morning light spilled across Ava's small apartment, soft and golden. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ink, the scent of her new life. It had been months since she left everything behind. The mansion, the luxury, the name Steel Group whispered in every corner of Manhattan. Now she had peace. Fragile, quiet peace. She spent her days sketching at her tiny kitchen table, creating designs that came straight from the ashes of her heartbreak. Every stroke of her pencil carried pieces of what she'd lost, and what she was determined to become. And then, one morning, her phone buzzed again. Croft Studio. The same message she'd stared at for hours weeks ago was now followed by another. "We'd love to see your work in person. Are you available to meet this Thursday?" Her pulse quickened. Croft Studio wasn't just any company. It was the pinnacle of design, the empire every designer dreamed of working for. Founded by Edward Croft, it was the creative heartbeat of the fashion world. She hesitated only a moment before replying, "Yes, Thursday works." When she arrived, the Croft headquarters towered above the Manhattan skyline like a cathedral of glass and steel. The lobby gleamed, modern, minimalist, intimidating. "Ms. Steele?" the receptionist greeted warmly. "Mr. Croft will see you now." Ava took a deep breath and followed her into the elevator. The doors slid open to a breathtaking studio, walls covered in mood boards, fabric swatches, and digital displays of current campaigns. At the center of it all stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with rolled-up sleeves and the kind of focus that made the air around him hum. Julian Croft. The name hit her like a memory, her old rival. In college, they'd competed for every scholarship, every award, every ounce of recognition. He'd been brilliant, arrogant, infuriatingly talented, and to her own annoyance, unforgettable. When he turned and their eyes met, recognition flashed in both faces. "Steele," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here." "Neither did I," she replied coolly. "Guess life has a strange sense of humor." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a table stacked with design portfolios. "Show me what you've got." For the next hour, she walked him through her sketches, pieces inspired by grief and growth, by endings and rebirth. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. When she finished, Julian didn't say anything. He just looked at her drawings, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You've changed." Ava frowned. "That's what happens when life falls apart." He looked up at her then, not with arrogance, but something softer. "It didn't fall apart. It evolved," she blinked. That was the last thing she expected him to say. Julian closed her portfolio and smiled faintly. "Welcome to Croft Studio, Steele. Let's see what you can do." Working under Julian Croft was complicated. He was demanding, perfectionistic, and utterly relentless. He pushed everyone, but he pushed her harder. Sometimes it felt personal. Sometimes it probably was. But no matter how sharp their arguments got, their ideas always found harmony. His precision and her intuition were like two opposing forces that somehow created brilliance when they collided. "Your concept is too safe," he'd say during team meetings, and "yours is too calculated," she'd fire back. The team would fall silent, watching sparks fly, not out of hostility, but passion. And when the deadlines came, they delivered every time. Late nights at the studio became routine. One evening, Julian found her asleep at her desk, a pen still in her hand. He placed a blanket over her shoulders quietly, then stood there for a moment, studying her. There was something about the way she worked, a mix of fragility and fire. He'd known her as a competitor, but this woman was different, stronger, more deliberate. The next morning, when she woke to find the blanket, she smiled faintly. "You?" she asked, holding it up. He shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." Didn't think the great Julian Croft believed in kindness. He met her gaze. "Didn't think you needed saving." She looked down, the teasing fading. "I don't, I know," he said quietly. "But sometimes, even the strongest people deserve a soft place to land." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Over the next year, their dynamic changed. The tension between them shifted. Less rivalry, more rhythm. They learned each other's unspoken language, how she'd hum softly when an idea struck, how he'd pace when frustrated, how silence between them never felt uncomfortable anymore. Julian began to see more than talent in her. He saw resilience, the kind that only came from breaking and rebuilding yourself. One night, after presenting a new campaign, Edward Croft himself walked into the room. He studied Ava's designs, his seasoned eyes lighting up. "This is remarkable," he said. "Fresh, emotional, alive." Julian crossed his arms, pride flickering across his face. "That's Steele's work. She led the entire project." Ava blushed, unsure how to react. Edward turned to her. "I want you to head a new division. A line that captures this voice, this emotion. What do you think of launching your own brand under Croft Studio?" She blinked in disbelief. "My own brand?" Julian smiled. "Aurora Atelier. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" And that's how it began. Months later, Aurora Atelier became one of Croft Studio's most successful lines, a blend of elegance and vulnerability, luxury and humanity. Every design she made carried her story, not her pain, but her growth. She no longer hid from the past. She used it, transformed it. When the press asked about the name, she smiled and said, "Aurora means dawn, a reminder that even the darkest night ends with light." Julian watched her flourish with quiet admiration. She'd come so far from the broken woman who'd walked into his office that day. Now she commanded boardrooms, inspired young designers, and carried herself with the grace of someone who had lost everything and still refused to crumble. But sometimes, when the room went quiet and her laughter faded, he caught a glimpse of that old shadow in her eyes, the kind of hurt that success couldn't erase. He never asked. He just stayed close. One afternoon, Edward called them both into his office. "Croft Studio has finalized a partnership with Steele Group," he announced. "There's a gala next week to celebrate. I want both of you there as our representatives." Ava's breath caught in her throat. Steele Group. For a moment, the room blurred, her mind replaying the boardroom arguments, Liam's betrayal, her father's quiet resignation. Julian noticed the shift in her expression. "You don't have to go," he said softly. She straightened, her voice calm. "Yes, I do," he studied her. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because I'm not running from ghosts anymore." The night of the gala arrived. Ava stood before the mirror, adjusting her silver gown. Her reflection looked different, stronger, calmer. The woman staring back wasn't defined by the past anymore. Julian appeared behind her, dressed in a tailored black suit. "You ready?" She smiled faintly, "As I'll ever be." As they walked into the grand ballroom, the chandeliers sparkled above them, and the music swelled. Ava took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Funny," she said quietly. "I used to dream of coming to these events as someone's wife." Julian looked at her, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Tonight, you're here as yourself, and that's worth a lot more." She smiled, touched, and stepped forward. The room turned as she entered, whispers spreading through the crowd, admiration, curiosity, awe, and then, from across the ballroom, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Still wearing silver, Ava?" Her heart stopped. Liam Vaughn stood there, handsome as ever, confidence dripping from every word, Samantha Reed on his arm. Ava straightened her shoulders, the corners of her mouth lifting. This time, she wasn't the same woman who once trembled under his shadow, because tonight, under the glittering lights of Manhattan, the story was no longer his to tell. The music was soft and polished, the kind played at events where every smile hit a motive. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the ballroom like captured stars, and the city's most powerful names floated through the golden light. Ava Steele stood at the edge of it all, a glass of champagne in her hand, her silver gown catching the glow like molten moonlight. She looked composed, untouchable, a woman who'd learned how to wear silence like armor. Julian Croft stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, guiding her through the crowd with effortless poise. Everywhere they went, heads turned. Cameras flashed. People whispered, "Isn't that Ava Steele?" Someone murmured, "She's with Julian Croft. Heard she's running her own design line now." After what happened with Steele Group, that's incredible. Ava smiled politely at the murmurs but said nothing. She'd learned long ago that power didn't always come from speaking. Sometimes, it came from restraint. "Are you nervous?" Julian asked quietly as they paused near the central display, where models showcased the Croft Steel collaboration designs. Ava exhaled slowly. I'm not sure what I feel. Maybe closure. He studied her for a moment. You don't owe him anything. Her lips curved into a faint, wistful smile. Maybe not. But I owe myself the chance to stop being afraid of his shadow. Julian didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression softening. Then let's make sure tonight belongs to you. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. She heard him before she saw him. That smooth, arrogant voice she'd once known so well. Well, if it isn't the prodigal wife, he said. Ava turned, her expression calm, composed. Liam Vaughn stood only a few steps away, Samantha Reed on his arm. Both dressed to impress, their smiles perfectly practiced. He looked almost exactly the same. Maybe a few more lines around his eyes, a little more weight to his confidence. But the arrogance, that hadn't aged a day. Liam, she greeted, her tone steady. Didn't expect to see you here? Didn't expect to see you either, he said, eyes scanning her gown, the way she carried herself. Then again, I should have known. You always had a knack for finding someone else's spotlight to stand in. The words were meant to sting. They didn't. Ava tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile touching her lips. Or maybe I learned how to build my own. Samantha's hand tightened on Liam's arm. You must be proud, she said sweetly, though her voice dripped venom. Croft Studio is quite generous, giving people like you a second chance. Ava met her gaze without flinching. Generosity has nothing to do with it. Talent does. The tension between them drew subtle attention. A few guests nearby turned to watch. The air began to hum with curiosity, that electric anticipation that comes before a storm. Liam chuckled, swirling his drink. Come on, Ava. We both know where you came from. Don't pretend you built this on your own. You were always good at attaching yourself to powerful men. The insult hit the air like glass shattering. Conversations nearby faltered. Even Samantha looked uneasy at his tone. Before Ava could speak, another voice cut through the silence. Calm, commanding, and low. I'd watch my words if I were you. The crowd shifted. Julian Croft stepped forward, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. Liam turned, ready to dismiss him, until he saw who it was. The color drained from his face. Julian Croft, the heir to Croft Studio, the man whose family's empire was worth 10 times what Steel Group had ever been. Julian's gaze was steady, unreadable. Ms. Steele, he said deliberately, is not here because of anyone's generosity. She's here because she's the creative force behind Aurora Atelier, Croft Studio's fastest-growing brand. He looked directly at Liam. And she's my most trusted partner. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones lifted discreetly. Cameras flashed. Ava stood perfectly still, her hand resting lightly on the stem of her glass. Liam's jaw tightened, the confident smirk collapsing into something brittle. You're her partner? He asked slowly. Julian's expression didn't change. In every way that matters, it wasn't a threat. It was truth, delivered with the precision of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make others tremble. Samantha's fingers slipped from Liam's arm. Julian Croft? She whispered, stunned. You didn't tell me. But Liam wasn't listening. His mind was spinning, calculating. He forced a hollow laugh. So this is your revenge, huh, Ava? Finding someone richer, more powerful. Stop. Her voice cut through his words like a blade. Calm, controlled, unmistakably strong. The entire ballroom fell silent. Even the orchestra seemed to fade. Ava turned to face him fully now, her eyes unwavering. You took everything from me once, she said softly. My name, my family, my peace. She took a step closer. But you could never take my worth, because my worth was never yours to give. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word carried the weight of survival, of every night she'd rebuilt herself from ruin. Liam's throat tightened, but no words came. He glanced around. The crowd was watching, every face lit by fascination and judgment. Ava smiled faintly, almost kindly. You told me once that power defines a person. But here's the truth. Power without integrity is just decay in disguise. Her words hit harder than any slap. Julian stepped closer, his presence quiet but protective. "Let's go," he murmured, but Ava shook her head gently. "No, I'm not done." She turned back to Liam, her tone softening, not with pity, but with closure. "I used to think you were my greatest mistake, but you were just my greatest lesson." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint clinking of glasses and the echo of her words settling into the marble air. Then Ava smiled, calm, resolute. "Good night, Mr. Vaughn." As she walked away, the crowd parted for her like waves. Julian followed beside her, silent, proud. Behind them, Liam stood frozen, a man stripped bare in the one place he'd always ruled. Samantha looked at him with something dangerously close to disgust before quietly stepping aside. The whispers began again, sharper this time. "Did you see that?" She destroyed him without raising her voice. "She's magnificent." And for once, Ava didn't feel broken or vindictive. She just felt free. Outside, the night air was cool and calm. The city glowed below, alive and endless. Julian handed her his jacket. "You handled that with grace." Ava smiled faintly, her voice low. Grace took years to learn. He looked at her, admiration softening into something deeper. "You didn't need to prove anything tonight, you know." "I wasn't proving," she said quietly. "I was ending." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the gala fading behind them. Then Julian said, "So what now?" She turned toward the skyline, lights reflecting in her eyes. "Now I build. Not from what I lost, but from who I've become," he smiled. "Then maybe it's time the world sees what Aurora Atelier can really do." Ava met his gaze, a small spark of warmth flickering between them. "Maybe it's time the world sees who I really am." Back inside, cameras were still flashing, but the focus had shifted. Reporters were whispering about the mysterious woman who had silenced Liam Vaughn with nothing but her words. And as the night went on, her name, Ava Steele, began trending across the business networks once again, not as the fallen heiress, not as the ex-wife, but as the woman who rose again, and made the world remember her on her own terms. The night after the gala, Manhattan glowed beneath a silver rain. In her penthouse office at Croft Studio, Ava Steele stared out at the city, a city that once swallowed her whole, now bowing quietly beneath her resilience. Julian entered, a glass of water in hand. "You didn't sleep." Ava didn't turn. "Could you after something like that?" He walked closer, his reflection merging with hers in the window. "You silenced him without saying his name. That kind of strength, it stays with people." She smiled faintly. "Strength doesn't erase damage, Julian. It just keeps you standing." He studied her for a moment, then slid a folder across her desk. "Then maybe it's time we stop standing still." Ava frowned. "What's this?" Julian's voice dropped. "Proof, or the beginning of it." Inside were documents, contracts, and internal memos, all tied to Steele Group's financial records. He'd obtained them through a quiet review during the Croft-Steele collaboration. What he found didn't just raise suspicion, it screamed corruption, shell companies, offshore transfers, inflated invoices. Julian pointed to the names on the page. These subsidiaries, Vaughn Dynamics, Reed Holdings, SVR Consultants, they're all linked. Money's being funneled out of Steele Group through fake development projects. It's textbook money laundering. Ava's stomach tightened. "He's still doing it." Julian nodded grimly. He never stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the discovery hung heavy between them. Old wounds reopening, old ghosts stirring. Finally, Ava said, "Then we end it." Over the next few weeks, they worked in silence. Late nights turned into early mornings. Ava combed through old contracts, internal emails, and archived board reports. Julian leveraged Croft Studio's legal team to verify the data. Each new file revealed another layer of deception, stock manipulation, forged signatures, fake investment funds disguised as charity ventures. It was all there. Written in the language of greed, one evening, Ava sat surrounded by stacks of papers, exhaustion shadowing her face. Julian entered with coffee and set it beside her. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. She looked up, eyes glimmering with both gratitude and grief. "I do. This is my mess, Julian. My family's name, my mistakes." He shook his head. "It stopped being your mistake the moment he started stealing. Now it's about justice." Their eyes met, a quiet understanding, a shared resolve. By the end of the month, they had everything. The financial trail was undeniable. Liam Vaughn had siphoned millions through offshore accounts, manipulated stock prices, and even used Samantha Reed's PR department to cover fraudulent charity events. It was a masterpiece of corruption, and now every piece of it was in their hands. Julian contacted Elliot Crane, Croft Studios' lead attorney, a sharp, ethical man who believed in doing things the right way, no matter how long it took. Elliot flipped through the files, his eyes narrowing. "This is enough to bury him," Ava exhaled. "I don't want to bury him. I just want the truth out." Elliot smiled faintly. "Truth has a way of doing both." He gathered the documents. "I'll contact the district attorney's office tonight." The investigation unfolded quickly after that. Subpoenas were issued. Accounts frozen. Steel Group's board called an emergency meeting that left every shareholder stunned. News outlets exploded with headlines. Steel Group under federal investigation. Former CEO Liam Vaughn accused of embezzlement. Ex-PER director Samantha Reed implicated in fraud scheme. Within days, federal agents escorted Liam Vaughn out of his Manhattan office in handcuffs. Cameras flashed. His face, once the symbol of ruthless success, now twisted in disbelief. Beside him, Samantha Reed walked silently, tears streaking her makeup. She'd already confessed to her role, trading testimony for leniency. The empire he built on lies collapsed in a single morning. Ava watched it unfold on the news. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply breathed, a long, trembling breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for years. Julian entered quietly. "It's done," she nodded. "Justice has a strange sound, doesn't it?" He tilted his head. "What does it sound like to you?" "Silence," she said softly. "The kind that comes when a storm finally ends." He walked closer. "You did this. You took back your story." She looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, her eyes weren't filled with pain, but peace. "We did this." A week later, the Steel Group name was cleared. The court appointed a transitional board, and soon after, Richard Steele was reinstated as acting chairman. When he called his daughter, his voice was full of emotion. "You saved us, Ava." She smiled faintly. "No, Dad, I just set things right." "Come back," he said. "The company needs you. We could build it together again." There was a pause. "I can't," she said gently. "That chapter's closed." He was silent for a moment, then sighed. Not out of disappointment, but understanding. "Then whatever you build next, make it yours." "I will." That evening, Ava returned to Croft Studio. The halls were quiet, the soft hum of creativity echoing in the background. She walked through the glass doors of Aurora Atelier, her name glinting in silver on the wall. Julian was there, reviewing designs under warm studio light. He looked up as she entered. "Your father called?" She nodded. "He wanted me back." "And?" I said no. He smiled softly. "Good. The world doesn't need another heiress." "It needs you," Ava laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You always know what to say." "Only when it's true." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Then Julian said, "You know, every time I think you've reached your limit, you prove me wrong." "Maybe that's what survival looks like," she replied. "Not running, just transforming," he smiled. "So what's next for Aurora Atelier?" Ava looked around, the sketches, the fabrics, the glowing city beyond the window. "Expansion," she said simply. "New collections. New cities, maybe a new beginning." Julian nodded, his eyes soft. "And whatever it is, You won't be doing it alone." Their eyes met, a quiet promise passing between them, unspoken, but certain. The next morning, headlines shifted once again. Liam Vaughn sentenced for embezzlement and fraud. Aurora. Steele redefines strength in the face of scandal. Croft Studio announces new global brand. Expansion. Ava turned off the TV and stepped onto her balcony, the morning breeze lifting her hair. Below, the city pulsed with life. Chaotic, imperfect, beautiful. For the first time in years, she didn't feel haunted by the past, because justice wasn't about revenge. It was about balance and peace. She closed her eyes, whispering into the wind, "It's over." And somewhere behind her, Julian's voice answered softly, "No, Ava. It's just beginning." A year passed. Manhattan had changed. Or maybe it was just her eyes that finally saw it differently. Aurora Atelier now stood proudly on Fifth Avenue, its glass facade shimmering like liquid light. Inside, sketches, fabrics, and vision breathed together, every piece carrying Ava Steele's name and soul. The grand debut of their first independent collection was tonight. Models floated down the runway in soft pastels and molten gold, the designs fluid, fearless, just like the woman who created them. From backstage, Ava watched silently. The crowd's applause rolled through the hall like thunder, and for the first time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt earned. Julian stood beside her, adjusting his cufflinks, his usual calm shadowed by pride. "You did it," he said softly. Ava smiled. "We did it." He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You always say that, because it's true," she replied. "You believed in me before I did." He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, a voice called from the stage manager, "Ms. Steele, they're waiting for you." The spotlight hit her as she stepped onto the runway. 1,000 faces turned toward her. Journalists, investors, artists, dreamers. Cameras flashed, but this time the light didn't blind her. It embraced her. As she reached the center of the stage, applause filled the room. And for a brief, breathtaking moment, she saw every step that had led here. The ashes, the loss, the fight, the rebirth. This wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. The next morning, Ava sat in a sunlit studio, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Across from her, a young reporter smiled nervously, recorder blinking red. "Miss Steele," the reporter began, "your first collection has become an international sensation overnight. How does it feel?" Ava thought for a moment, then smiled gently. "Peaceful," the girl nodded. "And if you could go back, to the past, to everything that happened, would you change anything?" Ava looked out the window, where morning light spilled across the city like a promise. "No," she said quietly, "because those losses, they weren't endings. They were beginnings I didn't recognize yet. Every scar taught me who I was and who I'd never be again." The reporter paused, moved. "That's beautiful," Ava smiled. "So is surviving." When the interview ended, Julian was waiting by the door, hands in his pockets, that half smile she'd come to know so well curving his lips. Philosophical as always, he teased lightly. She chuckled. "You were listening?" "I always do." He stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Ava, you've built something extraordinary, and I know you don't need anyone to complete it. But," she looked up, curious. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then said softly, "If you ever decide you want to start again, not from fear, not from loss, but from choice, I'll be right here." The words hung in the air, not heavy, not demanding. "Just true." Ava didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his, calm and luminous, carrying everything she couldn't say out loud. Gratitude, warmth, and the quiet possibility of something that didn't need a name yet. Julian smiled faintly, understanding without words. He reached for her hand, not to pull her closer, but to steady it. Just enough to remind her that she was no longer alone. That evening, the city lights stretched endlessly across the skyline. Ava stood before the window of her atelier, watching the last rays of sunset melt into gold. Her reflection in the glass wasn't the broken girl who once lost everything. It was a woman, whole, certain, alive, she whispered to herself. I'm finally home. And as the lights dimmed and the runway glowed once more for the encore, Ava Steele, survivor, designer, dreamer, walked across the stage one last time, her steps sure and graceful beneath the flood of light. The applause rose again, bright and endless, wrapping around her like a heartbeat. She didn't look back. Because this time, the story wasn't about the man who betrayed her, or the pain that shaped her. It was about the woman who chose to rise anyway. Under the brilliance of the spotlight, Ava paused, turned slightly toward the horizon, and smiled, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for herself. The light flared brighter, washing everything in gold. And as the music swelled, she stepped forward, radiant, fearless, free fade to white. And that was the story of Ava Steele, a woman who lost everything, only to discover that the greatest power was never control, but courage. Because sometimes it's not about finding the light, it's about becoming it. If her journey touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment below and tell us what moment stayed with you the most. Your words mean the world to us. Thank you for spending your time here, listening, feeling, and believing in stories like this one. If you enjoyed Veil of Hearts, please like, subscribe, and follow this channel. Because here, every story is a reminder that even after the darkest nights, love in its quietest form always finds a way back. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep your heart open. This is Veil of Hearts, where love finds its way through the quietest corners of the soul.